Chapter 1. The Question That Started a War. On 25 March 1900, the British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Mitchell Hodgson, summoned the chiefs of Ashanti to Kumasi Fort and delivered a speech that would set the country on fire. He announced that their king, Prempeh I, had been taken away and would never return, and that the British crown now held authority over Ashanti. Then he demanded something no one could believe. He wanted to sit on the Golden Stool. The Golden Stool, the Sika Dwa Kofi, was not a piece of furniture. It was the spiritual heart of the Asante nation. According to founding tradition, the high priest Okomfo Anaki had called the stool down from the heavens and caused it to land on the lap of the first Asantehene, Osei Tutu. The stool embodied the sunsum, the collective soul of every Asante person, living, dead, and yet to come. It had never touched the ground. No one, not even the king himself, had ever sat upon it. Hodgson had not merely made an impossible demand. He had committed an act of profound desecration. In the silence that followed, a woman's voice rose from the assembly. Her name was Yaa Asantewaa. Chapter 2. The Asante World. To understand why Hodgson's words landed with such force, you first have to understand the world he walked into. The Asante Confederacy was one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in West Africa. It had been built from the late 17th century onward by the Asantehene Osei Tutu and the priest Okomfo Anaki, out of a confederation of Akan-speaking chiefdoms in the forest interior of what is now Ghana. By the 19th century, it governed a large territory, with its capital at Kumasi, a city that impressed foreign visitors with its scale, order, and trade. Asante wealth rested on gold, kola nuts, and the forest itself. Kumasi had markets, goldsmiths, a royal court of considerable ceremony, and a system of law and governance sophisticated enough to draw comparisons from some European travelers to what they knew at home. A comparison they made characteristically with some surprise. This was not a society waiting to be improved. It was a confident civilization with its own deep traditions of law, spirituality, art, and political thought. The British presence on the coast was less than a century old. The Asante had been here for 200 years. Chapter 3. The meaning of the stool. To the Asante, a stool was never just a seat. Every chief and queen mother had a personal stool, a carved wooden platform representing their office, and, after death, a sacred object connecting the living to their spirit. The stool of an ancestor was a bridge between worlds. The Golden Stool, the Sika Dwa Kofi, born on a Friday, raised this to a national scale. By tradition, Okomfo Anaki called it down from the sky in the presence of Osei Tutu, and the assembled chiefs thunder rolled. The stool descended from the clouds and settled on the king's lap. In that moment, the Asante became one people. The stool carried the sunsum, the collective soul of every Asante citizen, past, present, and future. This is why no one had ever sat upon it. It was not a throne for a king's use. It was the spiritual container of a nation's being. To sit upon it would be to desecrate the soul of the people. To demand it, as Hodgson did, was to announce that you had no understanding of, or respect for, what you were ruling. Every person in that hall understood immediately what had to happen next. Chapter 4. A people who fought back. The confrontation of 1900 was not the first time the Asante had faced the British. Long before Hodgson arrived, there had been a history of war. The Anglo-Asante conflicts stretched back to the 1820s, when the British expanded on the Gold Coast and clashed with a confederacy that regarded the coastal trade as its own. In the First War, 1823-31, the Asante killed a British general, Sir Charles McCarthy. The Fourth Conflict, 1873-74, saw British forces burn much of Kumasi, but still could not break Asante power. The Fifth Confrontation, in 1896, ended differently. A British force under Sir Francis Scott marched on Kumasi, and the Asante Prempeh I made a painful calculation. He submitted to avoid a war he feared could not be won, hoping compliance would protect the Golden Stool. It did not save him. The British arrested Prempeh, his mother, and senior chiefs, and exiled them all to the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. The Asante Confederacy was formally abolished. Kumasi Fort was garrisoned. The Gold Coast held its breath and waited to see what the new order would demand next. Chapter 5. A Woman of Ejisu. Yaa Asantewaa was born around 1840 in Besieged, a village in the Ejisu area of the Asante heartland. The records of her early life are sparse. History kept court records, not the lives of farmers and family members. What we know is this: she was one of 2 children born to Kwaku Ampoma and Etapo. Her younger brother, Nana Akwasi Afrain Opis, rose to become Ejisu Hain, the chief of Ejisu. In Asante's matrilineal society, the Queen Mother's office was one of genuine political authority. The Ohemaa held the right to nominate candidates for the stool, counsel the chief, and, if necessary, lead the destoolment of a ruler who had failed his people. When her brother became chief, Yaa Asantewaa was named Ohemaa of Ejisu. She had married a man from Kumasi and had 1 daughter. Her daughter's son, Kofi Teng, became Ejisu Shin after the death of his predecessor, and it was Kofi Teng who was arrested by the British in 1896 and exiled to the Seychelles with Prempeh I. At roughly 60 years of age, Yaa Asantewaa had watched her king and her grandson both taken from her. Then came Hodgson's demand for the Golden Stool. Chapter 6. The night the chiefs lost their nerve. After Hodgson's speech, the chiefs met in secret council. The debate was agonizing. To resist the British meant war against a colonial power that had already demonstrated its reach. To surrender the Golden Stool, or simply to do nothing, meant accepting the final dissolution of everything the Asante had built over 2 centuries. The chiefs hesitated. The cost of 1896 was still fresh. The British had modern rifles and artillery. The Asante had muskets and courage. The outcome of another war could not be assumed. It was at this moment, according to oral tradition preserved through Ejisu and the wider Asante community, that Yaa Asantewaa spoke. No written record from the meeting survives. What we have is the tradition as it has been carried forward. In the version that has endured, she challenged the chiefs directly. She invoked the great founding leaders, Osei, Tutu, Okomfo Anarchy, Opoku Ware, and contrasted their courage with the silence she was witnessing. Then, by tradition, she declared that if the men of Asante would not go forward, the women would. She picked up a rifle. Whether those were her precise words, we cannot say. What happened next is documented. The chiefs resolved to fight. Yaa Asantewaa was made overall commander. Chapter 7. Commander-in-Chief. For a woman to take command of a military campaign in any society in 1900 was exceptional. Within Asante tradition, it was less without precedent. The oral record preserved accounts of women who had led in crisis. But it was still a remarkable moment. Yaa Asantewaa was appointed to lead the resistance, not as a figurehead, but as strategic commander. She organized the call to arms across the Ejisu area and coordinated with chiefs across the Confederacy. Warriors came from Ejisu, from Afinso, from Kona, and other regions. By some estimates, the combined Asante force around Kumasi numbered 10,000 fighters or more. Her plan was not a frontal assault on the British fort, which had machine guns and artillery the Asante could not match. It was a siege, surround the fort, cut off supply lines and communications, and wait. Wooden stockades were erected at key points around the perimeter. Roads were blocked. Messengers were intercepted. The Asante used their knowledge of the forest to move unseen and control every approach to the garrison. The British inside found themselves, in effect, prisoners. The war officially began on 28 March 1900. Chapter 8. The Siege of Kumasi Fort. The siege that followed was an extraordinary feat of organization. The Asante forces threw a ring of wooden stockades around Kumasi Fort that effectively sealed it from the outside world. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements could not get through. The garrison found itself confined to a hot, crowded compound with dwindling supplies of everything. Governor Hodgson, who had arrived with a small escort and had not expected a prolonged engagement, now found himself and his wife among the besieged. He sent urgent dispatches for help. The first two relief columns sent from the coast were beaten back by Asante fighters who knew every path through the forest. Inside the fort, conditions deteriorated. Ammunition was rationed, food ran short, and sickness spread. On 23 June 1900, Hodgson made a desperate decision. He and his wife, with a force of roughly 600 Nigerian soldiers and porters, broke out of the fort and fought their way south through the forest. The escape was chaotic and costly, with significant losses among the column, but Hodgson reached a relief force and was evacuated. The fort held on with a skeleton garrison. The Asante had not been broken, and Yaa Asantewaa had not surrendered. Chapter 9. Forest Warfare. While the siege continued, fighting spread across the countryside beyond Kumasi. The Asante's greatest military advantage was the land itself. The dense Ghanaian forest, thick canopy, tangled undergrowth, paths that only local fighters truly knew, made conventional European military tactics nearly useless. A British column marching through the forest in formation could be ambushed, harassed, and slowed to a crawl. The Asante employed what would today be called guerrilla tactics, striking at columns on the move, blocking supply roads, cutting telegraph lines, retreating into the forest when firepower told against them. They imposed heavy casualties on British forces attempting to push through to Kumasi. The fighting was not a pitched battle. It was a grinding campaign fought in heat and rain, with the forest always the Asante's ally. The British brought in reinforcements from the coast and from Nigeria, equipped with rifles and Maxim guns, a decisive advantage in any open engagement. But forcing open engagements was the challenge. The forest was Asante territory, and the defenders used it with skill. Multiple relief expeditions fought their way through before a sufficient force finally arrived at Kumasi in late July 1900. The siege was broken, but the wider war went on. Chapter 10. The weight of command, leading a war at 60 years of age, against an enemy with modern weapons and an empire behind it, required a different kind of courage from battlefield heroics. The record tells us that Yaa Asantewaa was not simply a symbol placed at the front of a movement others controlled. She was the commander, making strategic decisions and holding the resistance together through months of grinding war. This was not easy. The Asante chiefs were proud and independent men, each with his own stool and his own political calculations. Keeping a coalition unified, especially when the military situation turned, required authority and persuasion. Yaa Asantewaa had both, the authority of her office and the personal force that had led her to seize the initiative in the first place. The British reinforcements arriving at Kumasi in late July 1900 changed the balance. With a larger, better supplied force now inside the fort, the advantage of the siege was lost. The fighting shifted to the wider countryside, but the Asante's resources were not unlimited. They had sustained a large force in the field for months, without the supply chains an empire in full command of the coast could provide. Gradually, the war began to go against them, not quickly and not cheaply for the British, but inexorably. Chapter 11. The Stool That Was Never Taken. Whatever else happened in the War of 1900, one outcome stood above all others in Asante eyes. The Golden Stool was never surrendered. While the fighting raged, the Sika Dwa Kofi had been moved to safety by its guardians, hidden in the forest by people who understood exactly what was at stake. The British searched. They never found it. This was not luck, but the collective decision of many Asante men and women that this, above everything, must be preserved, that even if they lost the war, they would not lose the stool. The significance cannot be overstated. In Asante belief, a people whose stool is taken is a people whose soul has been taken. The stool represents the continuity of the nation across time, the living connected to the ancestors present in the living. Had the British seized and displayed it, the symbolic wound to Asante identity might never have healed. The stool remained hidden for years. In 1920, road workers accidentally unearthed it. There was a local furor and a political crisis before it was restored to proper custody. It remains among the Asante to this day, most sacred of their possessions, never sat upon, never surrendered. Hodgson never got it. Nobody ever did. Chapter 12. Capture. By September 1900, the Asante resistance could not be sustained. British reinforcements, modern weapons, and the severing of supply routes had gradually reduced the Asante's capacity to continue. The resistance did not simply collapse. It was ground down over months by an opponent with almost unlimited logistical reach. Yaa Asantewaa was captured in late September or early October 1900, along with a number of senior chiefs. The exact circumstances are not described in detail in available sources, but she was not killed. Given the attention the British public and press had paid to this war, which proved far more costly than the colonial administration had expected, she was too prominent a figure to dispose of quietly. The war officially ended in late September 1900. The Asante Confederacy was formally annexed by Britain on 1 January 1902, becoming part of the Gold Coast colony. The British never publicly admitted how close the siege had come to succeeding. They had needed multiple relief columns, lost soldiers they had not expected to lose, and the woman who had organized the resistance was, by any measure, a figure of exceptional ability. She was sent into exile. The land she had fought for was now officially a crown colony. She was 60 years old. Chapter 13, Exile. The Seychelles, a cluster of islands in the Indian Ocean, far from the forests, and red earth of Ashanti, had already received one group of Asante exiles. Prempeh I and over 50 members of the royal court had been there since 1897. Now they were joined by Yaa Asantewaa and the chiefs who had led the 1900 resistance. The British sent them as far from home as they practically could. Yaa Asantewaa spent the last 20 years of her life in the Seychelles. She was in her 60s when she arrived, and the Indian Ocean climate was hard on someone of her age. She remained in exile as the world moved on. The First World War came and went, empires shifted, and the people of the Gold Coast lived under a rule she had gone to war to prevent. During her time in the Seychelles, she is reported to have converted to Christianity and been baptized in 1904. The circumstances of this conversion are not recorded in detail. What the limited surviving record shows is someone who endured without being unmade. She maintained her dignity. She did not recant. She died in the Seychelles on 17 October 1921. She was approximately 81 years old. Chapter 14. The Return That Came Too Late. 3 years after Yaa Asantewaa's death, the British finally allowed the Asante exiles to come home. Prempeh I arrived back in Kumasi on 11 November 1924 to scenes of overwhelming emotion. He had been gone for 28 years. He returned not as Asantehene, the British had stripped him of that title, but as a private citizen, though no one in Kumasi saw him that way. Prempeh I made certain that those who had died in exile were not forgotten. The remains of Yaa Asantewaa and others who had died in the Seychelles were brought back to Asante for a proper royal burial, the burial her status demanded, and that had been denied her in death. It was a gesture of honor, performed across an ocean and a generation of loss. The political restoration came slowly. In 1926, Prempeh I was permitted to assume a recognized Asante title. In 1935, full Asante self-rule was restored, and he was formally recognized as Asantehene once more, the first in 39 years. He died that same year. Yaa Asantewaa had not lived to see even the beginning of this restoration. But the stool was back with its guardians. The nation she embodied had not ended. It had waited. Chapter 15. What the British thought they won. The British won the War of 1900. They broke the siege, suppressed the resistance, captured the leadership, and on 1 January 1902 formally annexed the Asante Confederacy as a crown colony. It was the end of an independent Asante state, in any formal sense. Hodgson returned to London and was not seriously censured, though some quarters criticized the recklessness of his speech and the cost of the war that followed. What the British did not win was the stool. They did not win the allegiance of the people. They did not dismantle the Asante sense of nationhood, which survived occupation as a living cultural reality even without political independence. The Asante court, deposed, exiled, eventually returned, maintained continuity of identity through years of colonial rule that would have severed a less cohesive society. The colonial record is one of extraction and administration, not consent. The Gold Coast was governed for the benefit of British commercial interests. Cocoa, gold, and timber moved out. British goods moved in, taxed and controlled. The Asante people built the prosperity that made the colony viable. They received little of it back. Yaa Asantewaa's resistance must be understood in this context, not as a romantic lost cause, but as a clear-eyed defense of a sovereignty that was real and legitimate. Chapter 16. A name that grew. Yaa Asantewaa died in obscurity, on an island most people in her homeland would never see, and her death was not widely reported. But names like hers do not stay quiet. In the years after Ghanaian independence in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African nation to achieve it, the history of colonial resistance became central to the new nation's self-understanding. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's founding president, invoked figures like Yaa Asantewaa as ancestors of the freedom struggle, proof that the desire for independence was rooted in Ghana's own past, and not imported from elsewhere. The name Yaa Asantewaa began to travel. Schools were named after her. A hospital in Kumasi carries her name. Her image has appeared on stamps, in textbooks, in art. She has been celebrated in music, film, and theater, the kind of storytelling that takes a figure from the history books and breathes fresh life into them for each new generation. She is invoked as a symbol of several things at once: Asante pride, Ghanaian national identity, African resistance to colonialism, and women's leadership. In the 21st century, her story reaches audiences far beyond Ghana, as historians and writers ask who has been left out of the account. Chapter 17. An Asante Woman's Authority. One aspect of Yaa Asantewaa's story that tends to get lost in the drama of the war is that her authority was not exceptional within Asante tradition. It was institutional. The Ohemaa, the Queen Mother, was a formal political office with real power. In the matrilineal Akan social system, authority and lineage descended through the mother's line, making women central to the legitimacy of any succession. The Queen Mother nominated candidates for the stool. Without her sanction, no chief could rule. She counseled the chief in private and could speak publicly in times of crisis. She held the right to initiate the destoolment, the removal of a chief who had failed his people. When Yaa Asantewaa rose to speak at the chief's council, she was not a private citizen raising her voice out of turn. She spoke from a position of constitutional authority, and the chiefs understood this. Her appointment as overall commander was extraordinary in scale and circumstance, but not a departure from all precedent. Asante oral tradition preserved accounts of women who had led in crisis before. Western accounts often struggled to make sense of a woman in command. reaching for the language of unlikely heroines. The Asante did not see it that way. Their political system had a structural place for exactly this kind of woman. Chapter 18. Ghana, 1957. On 6 March 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence from European colonial rule. It was 36 years after Yaa Asantewaa had died in the Seychelles, and 57 years after she had led the last armed resistance to British rule in Asante. She did not live to see it. She never stopped believing it would come. Ghana's independence was not the direct result of the 1900 war, which the British won militarily, but the refusal to accept colonial rule as legitimate, the insistence that the Asante were a sovereign people with their own laws, their own sacred objects, and their own right to exist on their own terms, was a thread that ran from the resistance of 1900 to the independence movements of the 1940s and 1950s. Yaa Asantewaa is one of the names on that thread. Kadwe Nkrumah drew on Asante resistance as part of the longer story of Ghana's freedom. The War of 1900 was taught in schools as a moment of national pride, even though it ended in defeat. What mattered was not only the outcome but what it demonstrated, that the people of Ashanti had never consented to being ruled. They had been conquered. There is a difference. Ghana kept that difference in mind. Chapter 19. The question of the legend. Yaa Asantewaa's story comes to us through layers, and the honest thing is to say so. The British colonial record, dispatches, military reports, the governor's memoirs, documents that a war happened, that it cost more than expected, that a woman called Yaa Asantewaa was named as its leader, and that she was captured and exiled. This part is corroborated from multiple sources. The account of the council, the meeting at which she challenged the hesitant chiefs, and took up a rifle, comes from Asante oral tradition, preserved and transmitted through the families and communities of Ejisu. No British officer was present at a secret resistance council. No written record from that night survives. The tradition is consistent across multiple tellings, which gives it weight, but it should be understood as traditional testimony rather than documented fact. The famous words attributed to her, challenging the men of Asante to go forward, or step aside for the women, exist in several versions and cannot be verified verbatim. They are what the tradition remembers, which is its own kind of truth. Oral history is not lesser history, it is differently transmitted. But a book that cares about honesty should say plainly, "We believe she said something like this." We cannot say exactly what. The Asante have never needed a document to know who she was. The story lives in the land. Chapter 20. What we really know. So what, in the end, do we really know about Yaa Asantewaa? We know she was born around 1840 in Ejisu. We know she was the Ohemaa, Queen Mother of that territory, a position of genuine constitutional authority. We know her grandson was exiled with Prempeh I in 1896, that she was present when Hodgson demanded the Golden Stool in March 1900, and that within days the Asante chiefs resolved to fight, with Yaa Asantewaa as their commander. We know the war lasted from March to September 1900, that the Asante forces besieged Kumasi fort for months, repelled multiple British relief columns, and imposed significant losses on well-equipped colonial troops. We know she was captured in the autumn of 1900, exiled to the Seychelles, and died there on 17 October 1921. We know the Golden Stool was never surrendered. We know Prempeh I returned in 1924 and ensured her remains came home for a royal burial. We know that Ghana achieved independence in 1957, that her name is honored across the country, and that she is studied in classrooms from Kumasi to London. The famous speech is tradition, not transcript, but the outline is real, the story of a woman who looked at an impossible situation and decided that it was not, in fact, impossible at all. A Note on History and Sources. This book tells a true story. The core events: Yaa Asantewa's role as Ohemaa of Ejisu, the sequence of British demands, and the exile of Prempeh I Hodgson's demand for the Golden Stool, the War of the Golden Stool from March to September 1900, Yaa Asantewa's capture, and exile and her death in the Seychelles in 1921 are documented in colonial records, British military dispatches, historical scholarship, and oral tradition corroborated across multiple sources. The famous speech attributed to Yaa Asantewaa, in which she challenges the chiefs to go forward, or step aside for the women, is oral tradition, preserved and transmitted by communities in Ejisu, and across Asante. It exists in several versions. No written record from the meeting survives. The book presents this as tradition and attribution, not as a verbatim transcript. We do not put exact words in her mouth. The illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. They are not photographs or historical portraits. About Griot. Griot tells the true stories of African and Black history with the care they deserve, researched, sourced, and beautifully illustrated. If this book is your first in the series, look for others including Mansa Musa, the Golden Emperor of Mali. Copyright 2026. Published independently via Griot.